71 children walked into a cinema one afternoon and never came home. There was no bomb, no gas explosion, no structural collapse. The fire that everyone believed was raging inside that building had already burned itself out before the panic even began. So what actually killed them? That question has haunted Paisley, Scotland, for nearly a century, and this story answers every piece of it. Paisley in the late 1920s was a tight, working-class Scottish town built around its mills. The streets were narrow, the houses small, the families large. Everyone knew their neighbors. The town had been shaped by the textile industry, famous for the woven shawl pattern that still carries its name across the world. But by the end of that decade, the mills were struggling. The economy was difficult, work was uncertain, and people were looking for ways to make the weight of daily life feel a little lighter. The cinema did that. In the 1920s, going to the pictures was not a luxury. It was the great equalizer. For the price of a penny, sometimes less, you could sit in the dark and be taken somewhere else entirely. By the time the decade ended, Paisley had 7 cinemas serving its population. 7. For a town of that size, that tells you everything about how central the cinema had become to everyday life. It was woven into the rhythm of the week, into the culture of the community, into the way children grew up. Certain of those cinemas operated alongside other uses, some part-time, some sharing space with music halls or meeting rooms. But the Glen, the town's first officially licensed picture house, ran full afternoon and evening programs every day of the week. It was the local institution, the one where the children sang before the picture started, where the projector failing mid-film was met with groans and stamping feet and the absolute conviction that the cowboy would come back on screen if you waited long enough. The Glen Cinema sat on the corner of High Street and Gilmore Street, right at the heart of town. It had been there since the start of the century, originally opening as part of the Good Templar Halls, a building designed for meetings and community gatherings, not for the hundreds of children who would eventually pack into it every week. That matters more than it might seem. The building was never constructed to function as a cinema. When an architect was commissioned to convert the main hall in the early 1900s, seating was installed on long wooden benches bolted to the floor. The stalls held around 600. The gallery above 300 more, with space for another 140 standing. It was a building operating at the very edge of what it was licensed to contain, and on certain afternoons it held considerably more. The corridors were built for movement between rooms, not for crowd evacuation. The exits were placed with the logic of a public hall, not a venue that might one day need to empty itself in seconds. When the cinema trade took over the space, nobody reconsidered what would happen if those people ever needed to leave in a hurry. The projection booth sat at the rear of the stalls, tucked beneath the overhang of the gallery, and the film that ran through the projector every single afternoon was made from nitrocellulose, which the industry simply called nitrate film. Nitrate film deserves a moment, because without it nothing else in this story makes sense. Every cinema in Britain at this time used it. There was no alternative that matched the clarity and brightness of the image it produced, but the people who worked with it every day knew exactly what it was. It was essentially the same compound found in early explosives. Chemically volatile, it could ignite without any external flame, generating its own oxygen as it burned. Once it caught, it could not be extinguished by smothering. It produced thick, toxic black smoke, and once it began generating that smoke, it did so fast. The industry had known about the danger for decades. Film fires had already killed people in cinemas across Britain and Europe before. Experts knew that if nitrate was not a fire risk, it was at minimum a panic risk, and that a dark hall full of children responding to smoke had to have a clear and immediate way out. The technology to replace nitrate at the same quality did not yet exist, so it stayed in every spool room in every cinema across the country, handled daily by projectionists who understood what it was and worked as carefully around it as they could. What they could not control was what happened the moment it escaped the room they were working in. There was also a law meant to address exactly this risk. The Cinematograph Act of 1909 had been passed to regulate the cinema industry, particularly around the fire risk of nitrate film. Local authorities were supposed to inspect venues, enforce safety standards, and ensure that emergency exits were adequate, functional, and properly managed. The problem was that enforcement varied wildly from one town to the next. In Paisley, as in many places, the gap between what the law required and what was actually happening inside these buildings had never been properly closed. The act existed. The inspections existed in theory. What did not exist was any consistent mechanism to make sure the standards the law prescribed were the standards that were actually being met, week after week, in every building, in every town. That was the world the Glen Cinema existed in. A town that loved its pictures, a building not built for the purpose it was serving, film stock that everyone knew was dangerous, and a regulatory framework that had not kept pace with the industry it was supposed to govern. None of it was unique to Paisley, But on the last day of 1929, all of it came together. In Scotland, December 31st is not simply New Year's Eve. It is Hogmanay, and it carries a weight of tradition that has no direct equivalent anywhere else. Houses had to be cleaned from top to bottom before midnight. The old year swept out, the new year welcomed into a spotless home. Food had to be prepared. Relatives were expected that evening. The table had to be set. And for the mothers of Paisley, who had all of that to manage, sending the children to the afternoon matinee was not an afterthought. It was simply what you did. So on the morning of December the 31st, children across Paisley were set loose with a coin in their pocket and told to go to the pictures. Some who had no coin went knocking on neighbors' doors, collecting empty jam jars to take back to the shop for a halfpenny each. One boy, 7 years old, had arranged with his friends the previous Friday to pool whatever money they could find. That morning he went round the houses gathering jars, counted the total, and confirmed there was enough for the matinee. His name was Robert Pope. He would later describe the day with a clarity that never left him. He remembered sitting with all 8 of his friends in a line on the bench, the way they always sat. He remembered there had not been quite enough money for ice cream that day. He remembered the cowboy on the white horse coming over the hill on the screen when the film suddenly stopped. By early afternoon, the queue outside the Glen stretched down Gilmore Street. Children from toddlers carried by older siblings to 14-year-olds who considered themselves regulars. Some had been charged with looking after a younger brother or sister. Inside, the benches filled until there was no space left, and then kept filling. On screen was a silent western called The Dude Desperado, a cowboy picture that had every child in the hall on the edge of their bench, shouting and cheering at the screen. In the projection booth, a 15-year-old boy named James McVeigh was at work. He was described by those who knew him as small for his age. His job was to rewind the reels once they had been screened and pack them ready to be returned to the distributor. It was routine, something he had done many times. As was standard practice, he took a freshly shown reel of film in its metal canister through to the rewind room. Then he placed the canister on top of an accumulator battery. A short circuit occurred. The nitrate film began to heat. Then it began to smolder. McVeigh heard a hissing noise and turned to find smoke already creeping from the container. He understood what it was. He clamped the lid down tight to try to smother it, but the smoke had already escaped the edges. He picked up the canister and moved toward the nearest exit in the lobby, intending to get it outside where it could burn safely in the open air. The door was locked. He set the canister down on the lobby floor, still smoking, and ran back through to find the manager, Charles Dorward. Together they returned. Dorward smashed a nearby window, seized the burning canister, and threw it outside into the open air. It burned itself out on the pavement within minutes. The fire was over. It had lasted only a matter of minutes, and it never spread into the auditorium or reached any of the other reels. At that point, the physical emergency was finished, but in the time it had taken all of this to happen, smoke had already crept from the lobby into the screening hall, and inside that dark, crowded space, black smoke drifting through the air meant only one thing to a room full of children. Nobody knows with certainty who said the word first. Some survivors recalled hearing it shouted. Others said they simply saw people moving and followed without knowing why. What is known is that within seconds, the word fire had swept through that hall and the entire mass of children was in motion. Robert Pope, sitting with his friends in the center rows, heard screaming around him and thought it was just the excitement of the Western. He sank deeper into his seat and waited for the cowboy to come back on screen. He was one of the very few who stayed still. The children at the rear of the hall pressed forward. Those in front had nowhere to go. The movement was immediate and total. Hundreds of children driven by the same single impulse, and the building had no way to absorb it. The main exit that led to Dyer's Wind, the narrow lane running alongside the cinema, required children to move down a staircase into a corridor and then through a door. That corridor was not wide. It had never been built to funnel hundreds of bodies through in seconds. It was the kind of passageway that on an ordinary day, with an ordinary crowd leaving at a normal pace, would have been perfectly adequate. The building had been designed for orderly departures. What arrived in that corridor on the afternoon of December the 31st was not orderly, and the door at the end of it, the door between the children and the street outside, opened inward. A door that opens inward is manageable under ordinary circumstances. Under pressure, it becomes a wall. As children piled into that corridor from the stairs above, the weight of bodies against the door from the inside made it physically impossible to open. Every additional child who arrived added to that pressure. The door held completely. Some children in the balcony, seeing the stairways already blocked below them, jumped. They landed on the children packed into the rows beneath. Others clawed to the edges of the hall, smashing windows with their hands and arms, cutting themselves, screaming for anyone outside to hear. Gas fittings were broken in the chaos, sending additional fumes hissing into the air. The electric lighting, never particularly powerful, became almost invisible behind the wall of black smoke. In the space of a few minutes, a full and joyful hall had become completely dark and completely sealed. Outside, the first children who had managed to push through the front foyer into the street were already screaming for help. Passers-by stopped. Then more people arrived. Men picked up whatever was heavy enough to use against the iron gate at the rear of the building, the gate separating the street from the exit door in Dyer's wind. Others wrapped handkerchiefs around their faces and pushed through the narrow windows the children had already smashed, pulling bodies out by whatever they could grab, ignoring the glass opening their arms. A policeman arrived and broke the padlock, but the door still would not move. The weight of children pressing from the inside was absolute. He had to force his body against it, shifting it inch by inch, moving what lay behind it before a gap could be made. What he found when he got through was something he described for the rest of his life. Children were piled 3 and 4 deep in the corridor. They were wedged so tightly together that rescuers said they had to be prized apart. One eyewitness described them as packed like herrings in a tin. From near the bottom of the pile, rescuers heard a thin voice and saw a small hand moving. They cleared body after body to reach the child beneath. By the time they got to him, he was gone. The life had been crushed out of him while they were still working toward him. 2 moments from the rescue have never been forgotten. A man rushed in the moment the alarm was raised, forced his way up to the balcony, and came back down holding a child under each arm. He leaped from the balcony edge onto the stage, broke 2 ribs on landing, handed both children to someone else, and went straight back in. He carried out 4 more before the pain made standing impossible. When someone tried to take him to hospital, he refused. He said the doctors had enough to deal with. The second involves a 12-year-old boy named James Johnstone. He made it out. He was standing on the street safe when he realized the 5-year-old girl he had been given charge of, little Lily Buchanan, was not with him. He said he would need to go back for her, slipped through the crowd before anyone could stop him, and disappeared back into the building. He was found inside, hand in hand with Lily. They were both dead. Every death certificate from that afternoon recorded the same cause: asphyxia by crushing, not fire, not smoke inhalation, the physical pressure of bodies compressed against each other in a space built for nothing like this. Robert Pope came back to himself when a fireman tapped him on the shoulder. He was still in his seat. The hall around him was empty and wrecked. Benches broken, suites across the floor, clothing abandoned. The fireman told him to run home to his mother. He walked out into a town that had already become something different from the one he had left that morning. His friend William Spears, who had been sitting next to him just a short while before, never walked out at all. Emily Brown was 5. She had gone with her sisters, one 3 years old and one 10, and had reached a window. A fireman smashed the glass and pulled her out. She was separated from her sisters in the chaos. They had survived. Many of her friends had not. Decades later, she would say simply that most of the people in Paisley lost somebody that day. Within minutes of the doors being forced, the town's 2 ambulances were already overwhelmed. Private cars were pressed into service. 2 trams were commandeered and cleared to carry children. The Royal Alexandra Infirmary had no warning of what was coming. Mattresses were hauled from storage and laid in every corridor. Doctors and nurses moved between children, many of them weeping as they worked. One man helping carry children inside, a veteran of the First World War, looked around at the rows of small bodies and said he had seen terrible things in France, but nothing that compared to what he was seeing that afternoon. Parents who had spent the afternoon cleaning their homes for Hogmanay heard the news by word of mouth, a neighbor at the door, a sound of something wrong moving through the streets. Some came to the cinema and pulled children out through the broken windows themselves, not yet knowing whether their own were alive. Others went directly to the hospital and moved from corridor to corridor looking for faces they recognized. Parents pleaded with strangers at the hospital gates to help them find their children. Some were taken to the chapel and the mortuary, where they filed past rows of small bodies laid out in sequence. Every now and then someone found who they were looking for, and the sound that followed was relief. Every now and then the cry that moved through the corridor was something else entirely. The tables set for Hogmanay that evening went untouched. Clocks moved toward midnight in houses where nobody was counting. New Year celebrations in Paisley were canceled. The crowd that normally filled Paisley Cross that night stood quiet. The Glen cinema building sat dark behind them. The next morning brought a stunned town its full count. Not all the children had died at once. 2 had survived the day only to die from their injuries in the days that followed, bringing the total to 71. Around 40 others had been injured, some with broken bones, some with footprints pressed into their skin from where they had been stood upon in the crush, some who could not walk again for months. In a town where everyone already knew everyone, almost no street had been left untouched. Classrooms across Paisley opened the following week with empty seats that stayed empty. The McInhill family lost 3 children, 2 sons named James and Edward, and a daughter named Margaret. They were buried together. The family living a few doors down on the same street lost 2. One of the men who dug the graves at Hogmanay Cemetery buried 2 of his own children in them. Another gravedigger buried 1. The funerals took place in the first days of the new year, the majority on a bleak Saturday when flags across Paisley flew at half-mast and every business in the town closed. 54 children were carried into St. Mirren's Cathedral in a procession of small white coffins that began at early morning and did not end until dusk. The Boys' Brigade walked in the procession. Hospital staff who had worked through the night came out and stood in the street. Thousands lined the route in silence. The children were laid to rest at Hogmanay Cemetery, where a stone memorial was built to carry all 71 names. One gravestone noted by those who visited in the years that followed gave a child's age in years and months. Not years alone, years and months. There was no counseling, no framework of support, no language in 1930 for what the survivors were carrying. The children who walked out of the Glen cinema were expected to return to school, to their routines, to their lives. Some managed it, others never did. Those who had seen what happened in that corridor went quiet and stayed quiet for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Some left Paisley as soon as they were old enough, moving far enough away that the name Glen Cinema meant nothing to the people around them. Like the soldiers who had come back from the Great War a decade earlier, they found that silence was the only way to carry it in a world that had no vocabulary for what they had been through. 3-year-old Donald Gribben was so frightened of going home without the shoe he had lost in the crush that he went back into the cinema after the bodies had been cleared and scrabbled through the sweet wrappers and abandoned clothing until he found it. Hugh Stewart sat completely still in the middle of the chaos until a rescuer reached him. Of all the children who had gone to the cinema from his street, 10-year-old William Porter was the only one to come home. Many of the survivors, when approached by researchers and writers in later decades, chose to remain anonymous. The event had shaped the entirety of their lives in ways that were still too private, too raw, to be handed to a stranger. An official inquiry was convened in Edinburgh several months later. What came out of it was precise and damning in equal measure. It emerged that earlier on the morning of December the 31st, the Paisley Fire Brigade had conducted a formal inspection of the Glen Cinema. Every exit was deemed to be in order. The building was pronounced fit for operation. Less than 2 hours later, the children were dead inside it. The inquiry established that the fire had begun through a short circuit when James McVeigh placed the film canister on the battery in the rewind room. That was the technical origin, but the inquiry was equally concerned with what happened after the smoke entered the hall, and the answer to that was architectural and human in equal parts. The building had too few exits. Those it had were not wide enough. The door in Dyer's Wind opened inward, which under crowd pressure made it impossible to open from inside. The inquiry also found that the cinema's staff had left the auditorium entirely to attend to the film situation, abandoning hundreds of children with no adult guidance during the panic. The official report was explicit. The staff's actions in leaving the children to attend to the fire had contributed directly to the magnitude of the disaster. On the question of the padlock, the inquiry heard conflicting accounts. Owner James Graham stated he had repeatedly told manager Charles Dorward that exits were never to be locked during children's performances. He testified that he had in fact reprimanded staff on at least 2 previous occasions for closing the gate during matinees. Dorward admitted the exits were sometimes locked to prevent children sneaking in without paying, but insisted he had personally unlocked the Dyer's Wind gate that day. The cinema's chocolate seller, Isla Muir, corroborated that she had seen the gate unlocked before the performance began. Nobody could explain why. When the policeman arrived outside, it was padlocked again. Dorward was charged with culpable homicide. The jury deliberated for 18 minutes and returned a verdict of not guilty. No one else was charged. No one was ever convicted of anything in connection with the deaths. The relief fund raised more than £5,000, including a contribution from the managing director of a major American film company. Paisley Town Council personally visited every affected household to express condolences and cover funeral costs. The surviving children were offered a week's holiday at the seaside. These were genuine gestures, but they could not answer what the inquiry had quietly confirmed, that a building had been inspected and certified safe on the very morning it killed 71 children. The news moved fast. Letters of condolence arrived from civic leaders across Britain, Europe, and the United States. Some were formal, some were raw. Among the most striking were letters from women who had been unable to keep their own children, writing to offer them to the grieving families of Paisley. The scale of grief directed toward this one Scottish town gives some sense of how the story landed when the world read it. Paisley received a donation to its relief fund from the managing director of a major American film company. The town that made and watched films had become, briefly, the place the entire film world was looking toward. And the world responded in ways that lasted longer than letters. Municipal authorities across Britain began conducting emergency inspections of their own cinema buildings in the months that followed. What many found was that the conditions at the Glen were not unusual. Doors opening inward, exits padlocked to control crowds, buildings licensed for purposes they were never built to serve. These were not Paisley-specific failures. They were industry-wide habits that had simply not yet produced a disaster large enough to force action. Paisley produced that disaster. The tragedy in Renfrewshire became the event that finally made the gaps in the 1909 Act impossible to ignore. The Cinematograph Act of 1909 was amended. The new requirements were specific. All cinema exit doors had to open outward. All exits had to be fitted with push bars so they could be opened from the inside by body pressure alone, with no handle, no latch, no key required. Seating capacity was legally capped according to a building's exit provision. A minimum number of adult attendants was required at every children's performance. Inspections became compulsory across every local authority in Britain. And then these rules moved quietly into every cinema, every theater, every public gathering space in the country. They became so standard that people stopped noticing them. The push bar on the exit door became invisible through familiarity. The Glen Cinema building still stands on Gilmore Street. For decades it was used as a furniture store, its original function sealed behind new walls. In 2005, a team working on a redevelopment of the site broke through the interior and found the original cinema structure still intact behind the shopfront. The auditorium was still there, preserved inside the shell of the building, the plasterwork still holding on the ceiling above the space where the children had been sitting. In 2021, a permanent memorial was unveiled in Dunn Square, directly across the road from the lane where the exit door had stood. It is a bronze statue of a young girl cradling a baby, entitled Rattle and Little Mother, the older sister looking after the younger one, created in collaboration with survivors, the families of victims, and the wider Paisley community. It was designed to hold both the playfulness of children and the weight of what happened to them. Every year on December the 31st, a ceremony takes place at the cenotaph in the center of Paisley. Wreaths are laid, names are spoken. The community gathers on the same date, year after year, because for a very long time after 1929, the disaster was not spoken about in Paisley at all. It was too close, too total, too woven into every family on every street. Silence became the way people carried it. The children who survived grew into adults who did not speak about it to their own children, and those children grew up knowing something had happened, but not what, sensing a weight in their parents that had no name attached to it. Only with time, with the work of historians, writers, and the community itself, and with the courage of the last remaining survivors to finally speak publicly about what they had seen, did the full story begin to return to the light it deserved. Survivor Peter Smith put it better than any official report ever did. He called it a fire that was never a fire, and that is exactly what it was. The flame was out before the panic began. What killed 71 children was not the fire itself, but the conditions that had been allowed to exist around it. A building not designed for what it was being used for. A door that opened the wrong way. Staff who left the children alone. A padlock whose key nobody could account for. They died in the last hours of a decade, on a day that was supposed to be the beginning of something new. The town they came from has never stopped counting them, and now, every time you walk out of a cinema through a door that swings open at a push, those 71 children are why.